Corlia. Taoiseach, Nino Dalmaijan, a 41-year-old Canadian tourist, died yesterday from his injuries sustained by an attack on O'Connell Street last week. God rest him, and deepest sympathies to his families and friends. Last year in this country, murders nearly doubled. Robberies, extortions, hijacking offences increased by 18%. Juvenile crime levels had a massive increase last year as well, with increases in theft, robbery, fraud and sexual offences by teenagers. Domestic abuse cases are at a 50-year high in this country, with 40,000 cases reported last year. I held a public meeting in Meath on the issue of crime recently, and women who work in the retail sector told me that if they catch children shoplifting, that they are often threatened that if they walk home that they will be raped if they go to the Gardaí. These women no longer feel safe walking to and from their place of work and now get lifts directly to the door of their place of work. Ireland has the highest level of drug deaths in the EU last year. Indeed, the drug fatality rate in Ireland is 4 times the European average at the moment. Ireland is becoming a dangerous place, and there's hardly a street in a town or a city where people are not living in fear. And this is not happening by accident, Taoiseach. I believe that the government are soft on crime, and the government are soft on the causes of crime as well. Last week, the country was rightly up in arms in relation to the shocking treatment of Natasha O'Brien. People are furious with the suspended sentence that was handed down to her attacker. And Taoiseach, you called for a zero-tolerance approach to gender-based violence. The Minister for Justice even stated that she will not tolerate any form of domestic or sexual violence in future. But Taoiseach, this is cynical nonsense. Not only does your government tolerate this level of crime, but your government policies are directly responsible for the increase in lawlessness in this country. Now, just look at the issue of sentencing. The Minister for Justice has admitted to me in a PQ that there has been a doubling in the proportion of appeals due to undue leniency in the court system in the last 8 years. 22% of all appeals in 2016 were for undue leniency. Last year, 42% of all appeals in the court system were for undue leniency. Sentences in this country are becoming more lenient, and that's a staggering change. Now, I have no doubts that the prison system being stuffed has an influence over the sentencing that's happened. The Minister for Justice also admitted to me that the prisons are radically overcrowded. She admitted to me that in just 2 years, the numbers of prisoners forced to a cell has increased 4-fold. The number of prisoners treated to a cell has doubled. The prisoners are so full that the Minister for Justice has admitted to me that she is carefully selecting criminals to release early to make space for more criminals to be put in. And that is a parliamentary question that I have for the Minister, black and white. Now, Taoiseach, you state that the sentencing is a responsibility for the judges, but not all the time. Legislation can be created to set minimum custodial sentences for violent and sexual crimes. But this government is allergic to the setting of minimal custodial sentences in law. And you could also strengthen the Garda force, which is on the floor at the moment. When will this government take the issue of crime and antisocial behaviour seriously?
We take it extraordinarily seriously, and your constant misrepresentation of the position of the Minister for Justice, time and time again, and indeed, I believe some of your commentary in terms of some of the changes that she's tried to make, and the introduction of wokery into public debate has certainly not helped, quite frankly, because if we're deadly serious about creating a zero-tolerance approach to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, it would be important that people in here have the courage to bring about some of the legislative changes that are required in that space as well. I want to again reiterate my absolute sympathy to the family of Nino on the most horrific tragedy that has been encountered, and confirm to this House that obviously there's an active Garda murder inquiry underway, and indeed there's been a number of individuals already arrested as well. I agree with you on one point though, Deputy, and I think it's an important point. I am concerned about the increased prevalence of violence that we're seeing in Irish society. And I know shortly after the leaders' questions today, we're going to have statements on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. And I think there's a number of very serious issues that we need to address, in fairness, some of which I've heard you speak passionately about before, in terms of issues around pornography, lack of sex education, how young men are experiencing these issues rather than being informed in a scientific evidence-based way as well. So there's a lot that needs to be done in that space. But I want people watching at home to know that contrary to your characterisation of this government's position on law and order, this is a government that has constantly supported Garda recruitment. It is a government that has seen 157 more Gardaí attest from Templemore as recently as last week. It's a government that, despite COVID closing the Garda College not once but twice, has put a real focus on this. This month we'll bring forward more proposals based on what we've heard from frontline Gardaí in terms of more measures we can do to help around recruitment and retention. When it comes to prison capacity, we don't have enough prison capacity, and that's not, by the way, meaning that we need to see an increase in incarceration rates. Just simply from a population point of view, we don't have enough prison capacity, and that's why the Minister has received approval to expand further prison capacity. It's a very important piece of work in relation to that. It's why we have put body cams on our Gardaí. I was there at the start of that process with Minister McEntee, where they've now been rolled out in Dublin. It's why we are changing laws around knife crime. It's why we've changed sentencing around assault causing harm. So we are taking absolute action, and there's nothing cynical at all about the Minister's commitment to domestic sexual gender-based violence. And I think even her most ardent opponents would acknowledge that this is an area she has placed an incredible focus and shown huge political leadership, often in the face of unfair criticism of her on occasion too, that should be called out for what it is.
Taoiseach, I think there's a disconnect between your rhetoric and the reality on the ground. And I think for people listening in to this debate, it's like you're talking about an alternative universe in many ways. I heard you talk about another task force. There's nearly a Father Ted element to that. Is there, anything to be said about another task force, maybe in relation to this? There's something to be said about actually employing more Gardaí, and this is the major problem, Taoiseach. And unless it's actually fixed, we're going to see this problem increase. Garda numbers are at their lowest per capita in the last 5 years. We have one of the lowest police force per capita in the whole of the European Union. Gardaí are retiring and resigning more than they're being recruited at the moment. And actually, for some months, resignations make up the majority of Gardaí that are actually leaving the force. And you mentioned the horrific deaths on the roads. I brought up the fact that 5 years ago, there was well over 1,000 Gardaí policing the roads. Now there's less than 600. If you don't have the Gardaí to enforce the laws, behaviours are going to change, and there's going to be more accidents, and more people are going to lose their lives. The collapse in the number of Gardaí has had a massive effect in making our streets and our town squares less safe over the last while. And absolutely, there's no doubt in my mind that unless we deal with the sentencing and the prison spaces, more people are going to get off scot-free with lenient sentences in relation to violent, sexual and assaults in future. And that has to change.
Well, let me start and see where I can agree with you. We need more Gardaí. That's true. It's a statement of fact. And that's why we're putting a huge focus on Garda recruitment and retention. You'll see more measures from us this month in relation to that too. And in relation to Garda roads policing, I've met the Garda Commissioner on this. I've met the Assistant Garda Commissioner with responsibility for roads policing, and of course met the Minister for Justice. I've personally chaired 2 meetings of the Ministerial Road Safety Committee. This year you will see an increase in roads policing Gardaí as well. There's also been a direction from the Commissioner in relation to a focus on roads policing. But we also know that killer behaviours need to change on the roads, and you shouldn't need a guard to tell you not to drink and drive. You shouldn't need a guard to tell you not to take drugs and drive. You shouldn't need a guard not to tell you to speed as well. Yeah, but let's not just say everything is down to the guards. When you, and I don't mean you, when one gets behind the wheel of a car, we have individual important responsibilities too. Second issue I do agree with you on is the issue of sentencing. Now, what we have done, and maybe we don't agree on how we get there, but what we have done is we have set up, obviously, the Judicial Council through the Judicial Council Act 2019, and there is currently a body of work underway in relation to sentencing guidelines. The first area that they're looking at in relation to sentencing guidelines is in the area of domestic violence, and they're due to have those sentencing guidelines in place before the end of this year. The second area they're looking at in terms of sentencing guidelines is the issue of fatal driving offences.
Thank you very much. Now